You just can't escape bad games. It's the sign of a living, breathing, thriving industry that we can have bad games in the first place and they don't really affect anything too much. I suppose it's important to acknowledge just how crucial they are. Not in a good way, but it's important that we have bad games every year. Until they get really bad.
At this stage, I'm worried that I'll make one of these one year and struggle to find enough genuinely bad games to talk about. It'll never happen, because people will always fuck things up and video games are hard to make, so I think we're gonna be fine. Terrible games serve an important role in making good games seem even better, making everyone feel even better about themselves, and maybe persuading onlookers that they could make a game if they really wanted to. Can't be any worse than any of this shit. 2018 wasn't anything special for bad games, but I felt like the negative stories were piling up at certain points during the year. Either a game came out that was significantly worse than fans expected, or a publisher was doing something scummy, but it promoted this sense of dread that things weren't gonna get any better. And hey, we had good games, but I know how the internet works. We'd rather focus on crappy ones instead. That Schadenfreude isn't going away anytime soon. Everyone thinks they can make a shooter game. We all think that we can tap into our understanding of shooters in a way that few FPS games have ever explored and deliver something vastly more unique than the usual subset of survival zombie military shooty games. Maybe that's just me extending to include other people, but indie action games are a dime a dozen these days. As are these really irritating awards given out to games prematurely so that developers can wave them around before anyone has even played something like Past Cure. You can fall in love with concepts as much as you like, but concepts aren't video games. And yet you have to admire the ambition that such a small studio attempted and failed to turn into a decent game. You probably learn with experience not to muddy the waters too much and to focus on making one type of game at a time. At multiple points in its Steam page, Past Cure bills itself as a story-driven cinematic thriller, which is a convoluted way of letting people know that they worked really hard on writing a story, but not as hard on stitching together a game that tries to be too many other, more capable games at once. It's very hard to pinpoint what the central theme of Past Cure is, other than the main character's amnesia and general confusing over his surroundings. I know how he feels! It's hard to be angry at this though, because Past Cure comes off as a game foiled by its own unchecked ambition, rather than the lack of talent in the dev team. Just make your own game and stop pretending to be Max Payne. It'll work out so much better for you. I'd like everyone watching to think back to 2017 and to tap into that one suppressed memory I know you all have hiding in the back of your brain. If it's my job to act as some kind of mediator and help you confront this memory, so be it, but you've got to accept that the new Bubsy game can't hurt you anymore. Most people have forgotten about Bubsy the Woolies Strike Back because it wasn't actually all that bad. It definitely wasn't good, and ironically too short, but it also wasn't the train wreck I think we were all hoping for. Not worth Black Forest Games forever sullying their name by being associated with the Bubsy brand, but hit developer Big D's didn't learn anything, because they went back to Shaq Fu for ideas.
These meme games need to stop. I love a joke as much as the next person, but after all the crap with Bubsy, you'll very quickly find that people aren't going to take to a sequel to one of the worst games out there. What are we going to do next? Are we planning a sequel to Superman 64? Does anybody want to tackle a remastering of E.T. for the Atari 2600? You might as well at this point.
But hey, somehow Big D's found enough people who dislike holding onto their money to raise over $450,000 for Shaq Fu, A Legend Reborn, so clearly I'm wasting my time. Morons will support whatever the fuck they like. What do you want to hear about the new Shaq Fu game? It's a lot like Bubsy, actually, being this bare-bones adventure and exploiting nostalgia that suffers from repetition and a fear to explore anything new and exciting. It's the Bubsy of 2018, and I fucking hate it. It's better than the original, but that doesn't really mean anything when the standard was set so low, and there comes a point where the jokey nature of Shaq Fu 2 wears off and you realize what you're playing and what else you could be doing with your time. The only way to make this work? play A Legend Reborn while listening to Shaq Fu De Return, Shaquille O'Neal's second rap album. Only then may you ascend, my son. No one deliberately sets out to make a bad game. Plenty of people decide to go ahead with an ill-conceived idea that was always likely to fail, but I genuinely believe that everyone gets into game design with the best intentions and with the aim of making the best game they can. That being said, it is a bit weird that we had a game released in 2018 called AGONY that has been given the perfect name. Did they know? Is this some kind of nominative determinism, like Usain Bolt being a sprinter and Christian Guy? Or maybe they were hedging their bets. Do you remember a few years ago when Hatred came out and it made headlines for being shocking and edgy but not actually good? AGONY doesn't put you in control of a psychopath with a gun, but it does pull the same trick of using rampantly disturbing imagery and scenarios to hide its many shortcomings. It makes for an intriguing walking simulator as you explore the gruesome, boob-filled depths of hell, but I think it's supposed to be a survival horror game, since it seems like all of this was designed to scare you. Except it doesn't, and feels more like B-roll from your average Doom game with a fraction of its competency in combat. The big problem with pasting blood and tits over every wall and enemy in the game is that you get used to it really quickly. And when that's the only thing your game has going for it, you're living on borrowed time. Or maybe it's time to make an actual video game. Dynasty Warriors 9. Any series that is still numbering titles up to the 9th entry in a franchise is either devoid of creative subtitles or so confident in its naming that everyone knows the number at the end doesn't really matter. We're up to 11 Mortal Kombat games for fuck's sake, but at least those have played around with a few different names in the past 27 years. Dynasty Warriors is over there not changing too much from game to game and slapping a higher number on the latest installment. But that's the interesting thing, because the 9th game was released after a 5-year gap for the franchise, implying that a lot has been done to revolutionize a potentially stale formula. And Koei Tecmo did that. They changed the combat and added a stamina gauge and made the map bigger and more open world. All these changes are awful. My biggest gripe and the biggest problem that may arise with open world games is space without content. I believe it's called No Man's Sky syndrome. Dynasty Warriors 9 has all this space to run around in, and if you're so inclined you can explore a lot of mainland China, with some of it not looking as identical as the rest. But there's nothing going on here. All that's changed is that the distance between you and the enemy at the start of a battle and you and the enemy commander is so much larger and requires you to make a concerted effort to traverse the huge landscape to get to the interesting things. How is it that you can have a 5-year development for a game and yet completely neglect to adapt a formula to an open world setting? It's like if Nintendo made Breath of the Wild but forgot to put any more content in it. Just make these open spaces big. It makes for the shallowest of puddles. So what's worse than failing to adapt to tired modern trends and provide the world with an unbelievably empty open world experience? Not a lot, actually, but if I've learned one thing from recent years is that we will never see an end to disappointing, really unpopular online multiplayer games. You know, the sort that starts out with barely anyone playing it on release day and just kind of ebb away into the ether and niche pages of history. The Culling 2 has the dishonor of being a sequel to a game that helped to drive forward the Battle Royale genre despite being quite bad, actually. But with Fortnite setting records and earning lots of people a lot of money, developer Xaviant decided to give it another go. Only for things to go even worse. Just to clarify what this game is, The Culling 2 came out at a time when the world knew what Battle Royale games should look like. It doesn't matter if it's Fortnite or PUBG or Call of Duty now, apparently. This is the level of quality that people will expect from this particular subset of video games. And then we have The Culling 2, which was clearly rushed out to take advantage of this new trend, and yet somehow even less refined and polished than the first game. And again, a reminder that the first game was also quite bad, so this is fucking awful. It obviously needed more time in the oven since no one took to it at launch. Supposedly there was an average of 13 people playing it on launch day, which is a problem when you need 50 to get a game going. And unsurprisingly, the Culling 2 was pulled from online stores just a week later. You know, if you can't beat them, join them. If you can't join them, you're in a lot of trouble, actually.
Early access games have always and will always be an easy target for videos like this. They're made on a tiny budget and often released in unfinished states so that they can use the player base in order to build the rest of the game, and honestly that's not such a bad idea when used correctly. They're very rarely used correctly.
There's an element of everyone can make a video game about this. If you dream hard enough and learn some rudimentary programming skills, then you too can create some kind of video game that reuses existing assets and makes a mockery of the already tainted early access label. It's the list-making equivalent of shooting fish in a fucking barrel, to the point where it doesn't really matter what you choose so long as it embodies everything that's wrong with this style of farting out games. Usually these kind of games end up on Steam because Valve lack the shame that their competitors occasionally demonstrate, and yet The Unknown City can be purchased from Sony and Microsoft stores as well. And it looks like this. Yash Future Tech Solutions, with their catchy name, have made a bunch of super low effort titles for Steam like Math Fun and Mounting Racing. But what sets The Unknown City apart, aside from squeezing its way onto other online stores, is that this is an episodic adventure wrapped inside a gripping story along with amazing effects with a climax that will leave players wanting to play next episodes of this series. It's a low-budget, very low-quality zombie survival game that frequently crashes and stutters to a halt under the heavy weight of countless glitches, horrifying graphics, and weapon recoil that renders the game unplayable. You're absolutely right, I'd love to see where you go from here. Make sure you reuse the player's interest and game complexity increases as game move forward mechanic. I really think you're onto a winner here. I feel like I'm harsher on big developers because it's my belief that they should know better. A large company like Sony or Microsoft shouldn't be making rookie-level mistakes that you perhaps make allowances for with an indie studio that is just starting out. I'm not saying that large developers should be incapable of making bad games, since there's so many little decisions that can lead to something terrible being made, and there's plenty of evidence of that. I'm simply saying that it's a lot less excusable. Square Enix threw their hat into the ring last year with The Quiet Man as they supported the guys behind the original Prey in their new adventure into ungodly pretentious third-person action games. I guess everyone needs a hobby. Conceptually, The Quiet Man is really interesting. You play as this deaf guy, which means that a lot of the game's events are heavily muffled for sound, so you can feel what it's like to not have audio help explain what's going on in a story. But unlike silent films that keep things simple and use words to convey important details, The Quiet Man leaves you out in the cold and expects you to piece things together in your own time. That wouldn't be so bad if the game wasn't also plagued by a horrible camera that makes combat painfully difficult, and also, The Quiet Man practically bludgeons you over the head with the shocking revelation that the protagonist is indeed deaf. They take it way too far, and the main character is so unreceptive to the world around them that it comes off as mildly offensive towards actually deaf people. That being deaf also makes you stupid or something. All I'm gonna say is that a deaf person wouldn't backtrack on the whole muted audio thing with an update that lets you play through the game again, but with sound. Do you know what a pointless waste of time looks like? I could show you. For years now, Bethesda have been sailing very close to the wind with their games. They straddle a line between being entertaining, very malleable experiences barely held together by a few lines of code, and something that struggles to adequately resemble a functional video game that just kinda writhes around on the floor in agony. The peak was always Skyrim, because it felt like world building and side questing were given special attention and lifted above the usual glitchiness that permeates every small part of your standard Bethesda game. If you skimp on the quality in one of these games, there's not a lot left.
I never played The Elder Scrolls Online, mainly because I've never really heard anybody say anything great about it, so I wasn't massively keen on changing that. But Fallout 76 seemed to be gathering a lot of momentum and attention from fans and critics alike. When I went to EGX in September, there were loads of posters for it, so clearly Bethesda were banking on it. How naive we were back then.
Astute observers will be able to tell you that the writing has been on the wall for a few years now. Fallout 4 disappointed a lot of people for one reason or another, but there was this concern that Bethesda were getting a little lazy and sloppy. This was seen as a step back when, really, Fallout should be going from strength to strength at this point. Fallout 76 marks a spectacular new low for both the Fallout franchise and Bethesda's inability to make a video game without stumbling over technical problems and the instability of their online servers. Also, one PR disaster after another and the slow, painful realization that the best parts of previous games were the NPCs and all the stories they had to tell. You take that away and replace them with a bunch of hyper-aggressive online randos and you've ripped out the heart and soul of Fallout for a goofy, glitchy online shooter. Hope you saved the receipt for that trade. I love fan-made video games. I love their ability to pay homage to the source material while also going completely off the rails and making something insane that no self-respecting developer would ever claim responsibility of. Often, the very best fan games that show a real understanding of what makes a franchise tick receive special recognition from the creators of the original, like how Sega hired fans to help make Sonic Mania, or how Nintendo shut down every fan project under the sun for challenging their copyright. Yeah, there's a right and wrong way to do things, but Valve this year resurfaced under their pile of shame money to endorse a fan-made Half-Life game. By which I mean they allegedly sold the Half-Life rights to some hacks who didn't really know what they were doing and are indirectly responsible for Hunt Down the Freeman. Nice job there, Valve. The wave of news this game generated in March last year was, at times, too much to handle. There were stories about this ambitious Half-Life fan game where you play as this Marine who seeks vengeance against Gordon Freeman for some reason, and how originally Hunt Down the Freeman went through an Indiegogo campaign that raised only $12 out of the $100,000 that was needed. Somehow, this game ended up being made, potentially down to all the stolen assets and YouTube personalities doing voice acting as cost-saving measures, and the end result is a bewildering mess of bugs and terrible game design, and shitty voice acting, although that was always going to happen. The game launched last February, except it didn't, because the game was so bad at launch that the devs claimed that the wrong version was uploaded to Steam, and actually there was an updated equivalent that would solve everything. It doesn't, and it is hard to find a more misguided waste of everyone's time and money out there these days. Everyone should have been very concerned when that Indiegogo campaign failed so hard. It should have been taken as a sign of things to come. I never did tell you how stupid Metal Gear was. Over the course of 7 mainline games and a handful of spin-offs, this story was told of super soldiers and nanomachines and poisonous hamsters, and somehow we all took it so seriously. Hideo Kojima, the madman at the heart of this spiraling, out-of-control creation, was just about able to keep everything together and cohesive. And he tried many times to leave the franchise where it was, but he kept coming back and adding to it, always finding something new to say or explore. Giving this tale a conclusive ending in the 4th game was no mean feat, and for those who could keep up, it was good. I enjoyed it, I suppose. Behind all of this were games where you'd waddle around underneath a cardboard box and do battle with supernatural beings with strange powers, and you can feel style starting to win the battle with substance, but this franchise kept improving, striving to build on the groundwork laid by previous games and to keep an obsessive eye for detail at all times, being responsible for some of the most amazing and memorable gaming experiences of my life. But it's gone now, consigned to the history books as this perfectly imperfect collection of quotes and iconically stupid moments, forever serving as a reminder of how much fun was being had over the last 3 decades or so. I guess as long as this is preserved, we don't have to worry too much about what happens next and where Metal Gear goes from here. It's not such a big deal that Metal Gear Survive acts as the perfect, unaware antithesis to everything that made actual Metal Gear so interesting, because it doesn't matter what Konami do from here on out, or in what ways they decide to distort Metal Gear's legacy in the future with more zombies or more microtransactions. I'll always have those memories, and that makes me feel a whole lot better.
This has been RabbidLuigi, and I said earlier that I believe that no one deliberately sets out to make a bad game, and I still stand by that, but I do find it intriguing that Konami made the perfect bad Metal Gear game, almost like they don't want the pressure of having to make more of these in the future. You know, they could have kept it on life support for a decade or so and pumped out yearly releases, but no, they killed it immediately. And I think I'm happy with that.